Colonial administrative systems. Major types of colonial administrative systems. The creation of colonies by imperial powers in Africa was necessary in the 20th century, after the scramble for and partition of the African continent. The colonial powers that immediately occupied Africa after the Berlin Conference were Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Germany and Italy. Although all these European powers had the same economic goals of occupying the African continent, they did not use uniform approaches in establishing their colonial administrations. For instance, the Portuguese, French and Belgians applied assimilation policy in their colonies and later used the association policy. On the other hand, the British employed indirect rule in many of her colonies except Zimbabwe, where they applied direct rule. Likewise, the Germans in Tanganyika used direct rule as their system of administration. The major types of colonial administrative systems were direct and indirect rule, assimilation and association policy. Indirect rule. This is a colonial system of administration, whereby African traditional rulers were involved in administering their fellow Africans at the local level while the colonial officials and administrators administered at the higher level. The indirect rule was pioneered by Sir Frederick John Lugard, who was the British High Commissioner to Nigeria in 1900. The motives for the application of indirect rule. The major reasons that made Europeans to initiate and apply the indirect rule system of administration in Africa were: 1. The Europeans did not want to interfere with the African traditional systems of administration. 2. The European administrators wanted their instructions or orders to appear as if they were emanating directly from the African traditional rulers. This was aimed at reducing African resistances against the European policies. 3. The Europeans introduced the indirect rule system with an assumption of civilizing the Africans. 4. In other areas, indirect rule was used when the system of direct rule had proved failure. For example, the British colonial government decided to use indirect rule in Tanganyika to avoid what happened to the Germans. Reasons for the British to use indirect rule in their colonies. The British colonial government used indirect rule in most of her colonies in Africa because of the following reasons. 1. Britain did not have enough manpower to administer her colonies in Africa. For instance, in 1900 it was reported that the British had only 42 British officials in her Nigerian colony. This number was not sufficient to administer the whole colony. The shortage of personnel was caused by lack of experienced workers. Moreover, British citizens were not willing to work in tropical Africa for fear of tropical diseases and other physical problems such as transportation. 2. Less funds were set aside by the British government for the maintenance of the colonies. Thus, it was convenient for the colonial administrators to use the indirect rule system in the colonies so as to reduce administrative costs. 3. The indirect rule proved to be effective and efficient in their Indian colony, therefore, the British government was inspired to apply it in Africa. 4. The British thought of using the indirect rule in order to overcome resistances from Africans. Consequently, African rulers were made to feel that their status was honored by the British, as this system of administration gave them an opportunity of keeping some of the money collected in form of taxes for their native treasuries. That money was spent for paying messengers and policemen's salaries. However, the local African chiefs retained the money for their personal use. 5. Physical barriers such as poor infrastructures, presence of mountains, thick forests and dangerous animals in colonial Africa forced the British to use indirect rule. 6. A language barrier between the British and the Africans forced the British to use indirect rule. Neither Africans nor Europeans understood the language of the other. Hence, they used interpreters. Strengths and weaknesses of indirect rule. The following were some of the strengths of indirect rule. 1. It avoided African resistance by appointing traditional rulers to rule on their behalf. Hence, all complaints were directed to traditional African rulers. 2. It was cheap, as local chiefs were used to mobilize their people to pay taxes and work as forced laborers. The following were some of the weaknesses of indirect rule. 1. Indirect rule created imbalance of development among African states. Areas which had local chiefs assisting the colonial government had development on social services like schools, hospitals and roads, while those which had no chiefs in their areas had no or inadequate social services. Such situations had led to many conflicts among Africans after independence. 2. It had created social differences among Africans. The chiefs' families and royal families got privilege of getting social services such as education, hospitals and many more, while the rest of the community were not getting such facilities. 3. Tribalism developed as an impact of indirect rule. African chiefs who were entrusted to rule on behalf of colonialists considered themselves superior to others in their land. For example, Kabaka Mwanga of Buganda created disunity among Ugandans when he declared the Buganda Kingdom independent in 1960. 4. African chiefs became puppets of the colonial administrators and did not serve their people. 5. The indirect rule cemented centralized bureaucracy through the use of the district commissioners. The indirect rule in Tanganyika. After the Second World War, World War II, all the German colonies including Tanganyika were redistributed among European powers. Tanganyika became a mandated territory under the British rule. The British rule in Tanganyika used the intermediate traditional chiefs who ruled under ethnic groups. The British administration system had several small units led by chiefs or headmen, who were just colonial paid servants. The African unit leaders, chiefs, had no power. They were subjected to removal from their positions if they could not fulfill the colonial duties. Some of the major duties of the African chiefs to the colonial administration were to mobilize their fellow Africans to produce cash crops in their areas. b. To mobilize their fellow Africans to offer their labor force to mines and plantations of the colonial government. c. To mobilize the people in their areas to participate in the construction of roads, railways, bridges and collect all forms of taxes for the colonial government. In order to exploit more African labor and natural resources, the British opted into using the local chiefs who ruled in the pre-colonial time due to the following reasons. They could easily mobilize their people to participate in colonial economy activities. 2. In case of any grievances, the Africans could directly face their chiefs and not the British administrators, because they were the immediate people who were implementing the colonial policies. 3. Also, the British were instilling tribalism in order to divide Africans and finally rule them. This was fulfilled through creating local tribal chiefs at the grassroots. The indirect rule in Kenya. The British ruled Kenya through the indirect rule system of administration. The indirect rule system used local chiefs in Kenya to govern their people on behalf of the colonial government. However, the British administrative system in Kenya was not uniform. Where traditional chiefs existed, the British used them as their agents and rewarded them with pieces of special alienated land and offered them titles of paramount chiefs. Such practices were common among the Wanga, a branch of the Luhya tribe. Other fringe benefits which African tribes acquired were the British assurance of military protection against their enemies. Children of these chiefs had the privilege of getting quality education at the mission schools. In areas where traditional African chiefs were not available, the British appointed their own chiefs. This was the major way of administering their rule to the decentralized African communities in Kenya. The major role of all African chiefs during the British colonial rule in Kenya were to maintain peace, law and order in their areas. b. To collect all forms of taxes for the British colonial rule. c. To mobilize their people to offer labor to road and railway construction, cash crops production, mining and many more, whenever required by the colonial administration. The effects of indirect rule in Africa. Some of the effects of indirect rule in Africa were 1. Large portions of land from the Africans were confiscated by the white settlers. This situation made many Africans to be alienated from their ancestral land. 2. African traditional political system and leadership were maintained. 3. Africans were economically exploited through forced labor, land alienation and tax payment. 4. The white settlers were favored much in land distribution, employment, representation in legislative council and areas for settlements. They were also given loans for developing or opening settler farms. The British administrative colonial structure. The British colonial administration was pyramidal. At the top was the governor, who was the highest-ranking personnel in charge of political and administrative matters in the colony. The governor checked if colonial policies were implemented and was responsible to his government in Britain. Under the governor were provincial commissioners. The district commissioners were under the provincial commissioners administering the districts. The district commissioners were helped by the local traditional chiefs who were assisted by the councils of elders. The British colonial administrators were mostly middle-class citizens who had a moderate educational background. Some of them were geographers, political scientists, historians, Sociologists and anthropologists. The indirect rule applied various administrative instruments to function efficiently. Some of the instruments were the native courts, treasury and authority. The native courts were courts created for Africans by the colonial administrators. These courts were classified and supervised by African chiefs. The courts were conducted through traditional African laws, though the Europeans considered them to be barbaric. For example, the He had sub-chief known as Vanzagila. Under him were the Jums. Under the Jumb were the Lunanzi. These were the traditional village court processors who were solving cases at the grassroots level for the He. Activity 2.1. Discuss the significance of indirect rule in Africa.